Hello, and welcome back to Religious Stories for Sleep. Well, not exactly for sleep tonight, because we're about to embark on a journey so uncomfortable, so bone-achingly exhausting, that you'll be grateful you're experiencing it from the comfort of your chair, rather than on the muddy, bandit-infested roads of medieval Europe. Today, we're diving into the world of medieval pilgrimage. And let me tell you, if you thought your last budget airline flight was uncomfortable, you haven't experienced true travel misery until you've walked 700 miles in shoes made of cowhide that were already falling apart when you bought them. Before we begin this sacred journey of suffering, I want to ask you to do something far less painful than medieval pilgrimage. Hit that subscribe button. Seriously, it's just one click. You won't get blisters, you won't contract dysentery, and you definitely won't be robbed by bandits posing as fellow pilgrims. Also, leave a comment below telling me which medieval profession you think would be worse than being a pilgrim. My money's on leech collector. But I'm open to arguments, and if you enjoy having your modern comforts put into brutal perspective, smash that like button. Now, let's talk about pilgrimage. The medieval world ran on three things: faith, agricultural surplus, and an absolutely stunning capacity for self-inflicted suffering in the name of salvation. Pilgrimage combined all three into one glorious package of spiritual meaning and physical misery. You see, in the medieval mind, the soul was like a dirty garment that needed constant washing. And where do you wash your soul? At holy places. Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Jerusalem. These weren't just destinations. They were spiritual laundromats, if you will, where the detergent was suffering, and the rinse cycle lasted anywhere from several months to several years. The thing is, medieval people had a fundamentally different relationship with suffering than we do. We spend billions trying to eliminate discomfort. We complain if our streaming service buffers. We consider it a personal affront if our coffee takes more than 5 minutes to arrive. Medieval pilgrims? They actively sought out suffering. They wanted blisters. They wanted hunger. They wanted to sleep in barns with animals, because suffering wasn't just the price of pilgrimage. It was the point. Today, we're going to explore this world in depth. We'll walk 700 miles in a pilgrim's shoes, experiencing every blister, every robbery attempt, every night spent wondering if that tavern stew will kill you before you reach the holy site. We'll follow the life of a famous medieval saint whose biography reads less like a religious text and more like an endurance competition with God as the judge. We'll unravel the mystery of how certain places became sacred while others, despite having excellent relics and aggressive marketing campaigns, faded into obscurity. And we'll follow the money, because while pilgrims were focused on salvation, churches were focused on something decidedly more earthly: profit. So settle in. Thank your lucky stars you live in an era with antibiotics and weather forecasts. And let's begin our journey into a world where faith was measured in footsteps, salvation was purchased with suffering, and nobody, absolutely nobody, traveled for fun. Let's imagine you're a reasonably prosperous peasant in 13th century England. You've survived childhood diseases, you have most of your teeth, and you own not one but 2 chickens. Life is, by medieval standards, pretty good. And then you do something catastrophically stupid. You vow to go on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Why would you do this? Well, perhaps you sinned. Perhaps you sinned spectacularly. Maybe you coveted your neighbor's ox a bit too enthusiastically. Or perhaps you skipped Mass one too many Sundays. Or, and this is always popular, maybe you just developed a creeping sense that you hadn't suffered enough lately, and God might be judging you for your comfortable existence. Or maybe someone else made the vow for you. This happened more often than you'd think. Your dying father, in a moment of feverish piety, might promise that his son will walk to Compostela if he recovers from his illness. Spoiler: he doesn't recover, but the vow stands. Congratulations. You've inherited not a fortune, but a 1,000-mile obligation to walk across medieval Europe. Once the vow is made, there's no backing out. Breaking a pilgrimage vow isn't just socially embarrassing. It's spiritually catastrophic. You're not just letting down your family or your community, you're breaking a promise to God. And medieval people took those promises seriously, partly out of genuine faith, and partly because they believed God had a long memory and a documented tendency to send down creative punishments for oath breakers. So now you have to prepare. And this is where the first cracks in your resolve begin to show. Pilgrimage isn't a weekend trip. You're looking at anywhere from 6 months to 2 years of travel, depending on where you're going. This means you need to get your affairs in order, which is medieval speak for liquidate everything you own and hope you don't die before you can rebuild your life. First, you need permission. If you're a serf, and statistically you probably are, you need your lord's permission to leave. He'll grant it, but not without extracting some kind of payment or promise in return. Feudal lords were not known for their generosity toward peasants who wanted to wander off for a year. If you're married, your spouse has to agree. This is actually one of the few areas where medieval law gave women some power. A wife could refuse to let her husband go on pilgrimage, and the church would back her up. Why? Because pilgrimage often meant abandoning your family for months or years, leaving them vulnerable and possibly destitute. Some men never came back, not because they found God, but because they found a nicer village somewhere else and decided to start fresh. Then comes the practical preparation. You need sturdy wool garments. Not your best wool because it will be destroyed. Not your worst wool because you'll freeze or overheat or simply fall apart. Medium wool. The kind of wool that says, I'm humble before God, but not so humble that I'll die of exposure on day 3. You'll also need a cloak. This is crucial. Your cloak is your blanket, your rain protection, your pillow, and occasionally your shroud if things go really badly. A good cloak could cost as much as a cow. A bad cloak will make you regret every life choice that led you to this moment. Here's where things get truly grim with footwear. Medieval shoes were essentially leather pouches for your feet. They had no arch support, minimal sole protection, and a disturbing tendency to disintegrate when wet, which, in medieval Europe, was most of the time. Some pilgrims went barefoot, which sounds spiritual until you realize that medieval roads were surfaces of compacted filth, animal waste, sharp stones, and the occasional bit of broken pottery. Going barefoot wasn't piety. It was slowly destroying your feet while walking. But shoes weren't much better. Within a week, you'd have blisters. Within 2 weeks, those blisters would have blisters. Within a month, your feet would be calloused horrors that barely resembled human appendages. Pilgrims often needed multiple pairs of shoes for a long journey, which was financially devastating for anyone not wealthy. You'll need a walking staff, essential for leaning on, testing the depth of mud, fending off aggressive dogs, and occasionally defending yourself against bandits. A good staff was worth its weight in silver. You'd probably carve it yourself from ash or oak, spending days getting the length and weight just right, because this piece of wood would be your most faithful companion for the next year. Then there's your scrip, a small leather bag that would hold everything you owned for the duration of your journey. Everything. You'd carry a wooden bowl and spoon, a water flask made from animal bladder or leather, a small knife, maybe a prayer book if you could read, some coins sewn into the lining where they'd be harder to steal, dried food that would quickly become inedible, and a small tinder box if you were fortunate. Every pilgrimage destination sold badges. Canterbury had ampullae, small lead containers supposedly filled with holy water, diluted with St. Thomas's blood. Compostela had scallop shells. Rome had crossed keys. You'd buy these at the holy site to prove you'd completed your pilgrimage. They were the medieval equivalent of, "I went to Jerusalem and all I got was this lousy T-shirt." Except the badge also supposedly protected you from evil and might reduce your time in purgatory. Now, let's talk about the truly terrifying part. Cost. A pilgrimage to Compostela from England would cost an average craftsman about a year's wages. A year of wages. That's not travel money. That's everything you'd earn in a year of grueling work. Some people saved for decades. Others sold their possessions, tools, animals, sometimes even their land if they owned any. Some borrowed money at interest rates that would make modern loan sharks blush. The church officially condemned usury, but there were always creative workarounds. Delayed payments, gifts of gratitude, voluntary contributions that were somehow always exactly the amount of the loan plus 30%. Wealthier pilgrims could bring substantial funds, but this created its own problems. You became a target. Poor pilgrims had to beg their way across Europe, depending on the charity of monasteries and the goodwill of strangers, which was inconsistent at best. The day you leave is devastating. Your whole village turns out because there's a decent chance you'll never see these people again. 20 to 30% of pilgrims died en route. Another 10 to 20% simply never returned, whether by choice or circumstance. Your family weeps. Your children might not remember you when you return, if you return. Your spouse holds on to you with the grip of someone who knows they might be a widow or widower by year's end. Your parents, if they're still alive, might be looking at you for the last time. The local priest gives you a blessing that's supposed to be uplifting, but mostly serves to remind you of all the ways you could die: disease, bandits, drowning, exposure, starvation, or simply falling down and being too exhausted to get back up. And then you walk. You walk out of your village, past the last familiar landmark, and onto roads you've never traveled. And the adventure, by which I mean the suffering, truly begins. The first day is almost pleasant. You're fresh, you're motivated. You have food that was cooked recently and hasn't yet started to ferment. The weather is cooperating. You sing hymns. You pray. You imagine yourself as a noble soul on a sacred journey, and you feel spiritually elevated. This lasts about 12 miles. By afternoon, you notice things. Your feet hurt, not the kind of hurt that comes from unusual exertion, but a specific burning sensation that promises worse to come. Your shoulder aches where your scrip's strap digs into your skin. You're thirsty, but you're rationing your water because you're not sure when you'll find the next safe source. You also notice how incredibly empty the medieval landscape is. Miles between villages. Hours of walking through forests or across open countryside where you see no one. The isolation is profound and unsettling. You're used to living in a village of maybe 100 people where you know everyone and everyone knows you. Now, you're walking through a world that doesn't care if you exist. When you finally reach a village that evening, you face your first real challenge: where to sleep. If there's a monastery or church, you might find charity, a place in the pilgrims' dormitory, some bread and weak ale. But these spots fill up quickly, and if you arrive late, you're out of luck. If there's no monastery, you need to negotiate with villagers. Some are kind and offer you space in their barn for a small coin. Others view you with suspicion. Who are you? Why should they trust you? Could you be a thief, a criminal fleeing justice, or a heretic? You might end up sleeping outdoors, wrapped in your cloak, listening to wolves howling in the distance and wondering if you've made a catastrophic mistake. This is day 1. You have approximately 240 days to go. By day 3, the blisters arrive. Not small blisters, medieval blisters, the kind that burst and bleed and make every step agony. You have no sterile bandages, no antibiotic ointment, no proper first aid. You have strips of cloth, possibly some animal fat, and prayer. Some pilgrims wrapped their feet in cloth before putting on shoes. This helped, but not much. The cloth would slip, bunch up, create new pressure points, or it would get wet and stay wet, creating a perfect environment for your skin to break down. The pain changes how you walk, which creates new problems. You favor one foot, which puts more stress on the other. You develop blisters on your heels, then on your toes, then on the sides of your feet. Within a week, walking becomes a meditation on pain. And the hunger begins. You budgeted for food, but food costs more than you expected. Or the food you can afford is barely edible. Hard bread, cheese that's more mold than cheese, onions. You're burning thousands of calories a day walking, but you're eating maybe 2,000 calories if you're lucky. You start to lose weight. Your face becomes gaunt. Your clothes hang looser. You think about food constantly, not the simple peasant fare you're used to, but elaborate fantasies of roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables that haven't been boiled into submission. The weather doesn't cooperate. Medieval Europe was wetter and colder than modern Europe. You walk through rain that seems to last for days. Your wool cloak, which is supposed to repel water, becomes saturated and heavy. It never fully dries. You develop a permanent damp chill that settles into your bones. Or it's summer, and you're walking through heat with no sunscreen, no sunglasses, no understanding of hydration needs. You develop sunburn on your face and neck. The glare gives you headaches. You're sweating constantly, but you're rationing water because you don't know when you'll find more. Let's talk about medieval roads, because they deserve special attention in this litany of suffering. Roman roads, where they still existed, were magnificent, straight, well-drained, properly engineered. But by the medieval period, most Roman roads were crumbling ruins. Medieval roads were, well, calling them roads is generous. They were paths, tracks, suggestions of routes that multiple people had walked over the years. In dry conditions, they were dusty and rutted. Cartwheels had carved deep grooves that would twist your ankle if you stepped in them wrong. Stones protruded at ankle-breaking heights. The surface was uneven, unreliable. In wet conditions, which was most of the time, they became nightmares of mud. Not regular mud, medieval mud. Thick, sucking, boot-stealing mud that could be ankle-deep or knee-deep, and you wouldn't know until you stepped in it. Pilgrims regularly lost shoes to mud. and some sources mention pilgrims getting stuck so badly they needed help to extract themselves. The smell was extraordinary. Roads served as bathrooms for travelers and as highways for animal herds. Pigs, sheep, cattle, all contributed their waste to the road surface. Human waste, too, because medieval people had no concept of a way. If you needed to relieve yourself, you stepped off the road and did your business. Multiply this by centuries of use, and you have roads that were essentially open sewers with a walking surface on top. Dead animals littered the roads. A horse that died pulling a cart would be left where it fell. A sheep that couldn't keep up with the herd would be abandoned. These corpses rotted in place, sometimes for months, creating obstacles and contributing to the general atmosphere of decay. Bridges were rare and often in terrible condition. Most rivers had to be forded, which meant wading through water of unknown depth with your clothes and possessions. If the current was strong, you could be swept away. If the water was deep, you might have to pay someone with a boat to ferry you across, another unexpected expense. Some bridges were privately owned and charged tolls. These tolls were often arbitrary and expensive. The bridge owner had you over a barrel, literally, if you refused to pay, and tried to float your goods across on actual barrels. You'd pay the toll, or add miles to your journey, finding another crossing. You'd think fellow pilgrims would be automatic friends and allies. After all, you're all on the same spiritual journey, right? Wrong. Medieval pilgrims were a mixed bunch. Some were genuinely pious. Many were doing penance for sins and weren't happy about it. Others were criminals given the choice between pilgrimage and punishment. Some were fugitives using pilgrimage as an excuse to flee their homes. A few were professional thieves targeting other pilgrims. Yes, there were career criminal pilgrims. They'd dress the part, carry the right equipment, speak the language of faith, and then rob you blind at the first opportunity. They knew all the tricks, which hostels had the least supervision, where to strike up a friendship before stealing your possessions while you slept, how to create distractions so an accomplice could cut your purse. Even genuinely pious pilgrims could be terrible traveling companions. You're all hungry, exhausted, in pain, and stressed about money. Tempers flare. Arguments erupt over nothing. Who walks in front? Who gets the best spot in the barn? Who's singing hymns too loudly or not loudly enough? The social dynamics were complex. Rich pilgrims traveled with servants and looked down on poor pilgrims. Poor pilgrims resented rich pilgrims. Everyone had opinions about proper pilgrimage behavior, and those opinions rarely aligned. Some pilgrims traveled in groups for safety, but groups had their own problems. You had to match pace with the slowest walker. You had to agree on where to stop, where to eat, where to seek shelter. Group decisions are hard enough in modern times with well-fed people. Imagine trying to reach consensus among a dozen exhausted, hungry, footsore medieval pilgrims. Here's something modern travelers don't think about. Everyone you meet might be carrying a disease that could kill you, and you have no way to know until it's too late. Medieval Europe was a disease paradise. Typhoid, dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, leprosy, and periodic outbreaks of plague. Any of these could be walking beside you in human form. Water was the biggest danger. You couldn't drink from most rivers or streams. They were contaminated with human and animal waste. You learned to drink ale or wine instead, but these weren't always available. Sometimes you'd have to drink water and simply pray it didn't kill you. Dysentery was probably the most common pilgrim disease. You'd start feeling sick, cramps, fever, diarrhea. If it was mild, you'd suffer through it, losing more weight and becoming more dehydrated. If it was severe, you'd become too weak to walk. And if you couldn't walk, you couldn't continue your pilgrimage. You'd be stuck in some village, hoping someone would take pity on you, burning through your remaining money on shelter and a healer who might or might not know anything useful. Many pilgrims died of disease en route. They'd be buried in unmarked graves far from home, their families never knowing exactly what happened. He Went on Pilgrimage would be followed a year later by He Never Returned. And that would be the end of the story. Let's discuss medieval food in travel context, because it deserves its own category of horror. At home, you ate simple but relatively fresh food. Your bread was baked recently. Your cheese was from local animals. Your vegetables came from your garden. Not gourmet, but not toxic. On the road, everything changes. The bread you buy is often days old and hard as wood. You have to soak it in water or ale to make it edible. The cheese has been sitting in someone's pantry for who knows how long, and has developed interesting colors and textures. The meat, when you can afford it, is of dubious origin and preservation. There's no refrigeration. In summer, meat spoiled within hours. Preserving meat meant salting it heavily, smoking it or both, until it barely resembled food. Tavern food was a gamble with your life. The stew might be fine, or it might contain meat from an animal that died of disease, vegetables that were rotting, and water from a contaminated source. You wouldn't know until hours later when your stomach started cramping. Food poisoning on a pilgrimage was catastrophic. You're far from home, in pain, unable to keep food or water down, and you still need to keep moving, because staying in one place costs money you don't have. Some pilgrims died from food poisoning. Others survived, but were so weakened that they had to abandon their pilgrimage or extend it significantly while they recovered. And the hunger, the constant gnawing hunger. You're burning energy walking all day, but you can't afford enough food to satisfy your appetite. You go to sleep hungry. You wake up hungry. You walk hungry. Hunger becomes your default state, so constant you almost stop noticing it. Except when you pass a house where someone is cooking, and the smell reminds you of what real food tastes like. Medieval roads were dangerous, not just because of their physical condition, but because of the people who frequented them. Bandits were a real and constant threat. Some were desperate men pushed to crime by poverty. Others were professionals who viewed robbery as a career. Some were members of the nobility who'd decided that robbing travelers was more fun and profitable than managing their estates. Pilgrims were ideal targets. They carried money, not much, but some. They were vulnerable, exhausted, often alone or in small groups. They were predictable. You knew which roads led to major pilgrimage sites, and they were easy to catch. You can't run fast when your feet are destroyed and you're malnourished. Bandit attacks ranged from simple theft to violence to murder. Some bandits would take your money and possessions and let you go. Others would beat you to ensure you couldn't pursue them or identify them later. Some would kill you, because dead pilgrims don't report crimes. The authorities were largely useless. If you were robbed, who would you report it to? The local lord, who might be miles away and might not care about a peasant pilgrim. The church, they'd pray for you, but they couldn't recover your possessions or catch the thieves. Some areas were so notorious for banditry that pilgrims would wait in larger towns to form bigger groups before proceeding. Safety in numbers. But even large groups could be attacked if the bandits were numerous or well-armed enough. And then there were the respectable thieves, the toll collectors and officials who charged fees for everything, crossing into a new lord's territory, fee, using a bridge, fee, entering a town after dark, fee. Some of these fees were legitimate, many were not. But you paid them because the alternative was being denied entry or facing accusations of being a vagrant or a troublemaker. We've talked about physical suffering, but the mental and emotional toll of pilgrimage might have been worse. You're alone or with strangers. You're far from everything familiar. Every day is a struggle. You're in constant pain, constantly hungry, constantly uncertain about where you'll sleep or what you'll eat. Homesickness was crushing. You'd think about your family, your children growing up without you, your spouse managing alone, your parents aging. You'd wonder if they were okay, if they had enough food, if they were safe. And you had no way to find out. No letters, no messages. You left, and you'd know nothing about them until you returned, if you returned. The loneliness was profound. Even if you traveled with others, you were ultimately alone with your thoughts and your pain. Medieval people weren't more stoic than us. They were just as prone to despair, fear, and regret. But they had fewer outlets. No therapists, no support systems. Just you, the road, and your prayers. Some pilgrims gave up. They'd get a few weeks in, realize they couldn't continue, and turn back. This was its own nightmare. You'd spent most of your money, you'd suffered immensely, and now you had to limp home with nothing to show for it. Worse, you'd broken your vow, which meant spiritual consequences on top of the practical and social ones. Others continued but lost their faith along the way. The pilgrimage that was supposed to bring you closer to God instead made you question everything. Why would a loving God require this much suffering? Why were you punishing yourself for sins that, in retrospect, seemed pretty minor? What was the point? But you kept walking, because stopping meant admitting defeat, and admitting defeat meant your suffering had been meaningless. After months of walking, you finally arrive at your destination, Canterbury, Compostela, Rome, wherever you'd vowed to go. You're gaunt, scarred, exhausted, and possibly disease-ridden. Your clothes are rags. Your shoes have been replaced twice and are falling apart again. You've spent most of your money, and now you have to navigate the ultimate spiritual tourism trap. Major pilgrimage sites were crowded, chaotic, and commercial. Thousands of pilgrims arrived constantly, all seeking the same thing: access to the holy relics, a spiritual experience, proof they'd completed their journey. First, you had to get inside the church or cathedral. This wasn't always easy. Popular sites had so many pilgrims that you might wait hours or days for your turn to approach the shrine. Some churches had special pilgrim routes that funneled you past the shrine quickly, very quickly, because there were hundreds more pilgrims behind you waiting their turn. The experience was rarely transcendent. You'd shuffle past the shrine with dozens of other exhausted pilgrims, get a glimpse of the reliquary, mutter a prayer, and be ushered along by impatient clergy who'd seen 10,000 pilgrims just like you. No personal spiritual moment, no divine revelation, just a brief view of an ornate box supposedly containing the bones of a saint. And then you were back outside. Then came the badges. Every pilgrimage site sold proof of completion: badges, ampullae, shells, tokens. You needed these to prove you'd actually completed your pilgrimage. Without proof, people might not believe you, which meant all your suffering would be socially meaningless. But these badges cost money, sometimes a lot of money. The churches knew they had a captive market. You'd come all this way. You'd spent months getting here. You weren't going to skip the badge. So prices could be astronomical. Some pilgrims, having spent almost everything on the journey, found themselves unable to afford the official proof of completion. They'd have to settle for cheaper, unofficial badges sold by enterprising vendors outside the church, or nothing at all. You might think completing the pilgrimage means you're done. You're not done. You're not even close to done. Now you have to get home. The return journey is everything the outbound journey was, except you're starting from a position of complete physical exhaustion and probable poverty. You've spent most of your money. Your clothes are destroyed. Your shoes are ruins. Your body is broken. Some pilgrims had to work their way home, taking odd jobs in the towns and villages they passed through, earning just enough to continue. This could extend a 6-month journey into a year or longer. Others begged more aggressively, relying entirely on charity. Monasteries were required to provide hospitality to pilgrims, but this hospitality had limits. A night's shelter and some basic food, yes. Extended stays and recovery time, not so much. The worst part was that the return journey felt meaningless. On the outbound journey, you were going toward something, the holy site, the spiritual experience, the completion of your vow. On the return, you were just trying to survive long enough to make it home. The spiritual purpose was fulfilled. Now, it was just a desperate race against starvation, disease, and your body's complete collapse. And some pilgrims never made it home. They died on the return journey, killed by disease, exposure, bandits, or simple exhaustion. They'd completed their vow, achieved their spiritual goal, and died anyway. Their bodies would be buried in unmarked graves by strangers, their families never knowing they'd come so close to returning. If you made it home, and remember, your chances were only about 70 to 80%, you returned as a different person. Physically, you were a wreck. You'd lost significant weight. Your feet were scarred and possibly deformed. You might have a permanent limp from an injury that never healed properly. Your skin was weathered. You looked years older than when you left. Mentally and emotionally, you'd been transformed. You'd experienced prolonged suffering, constant fear, profound isolation. You'd seen things, other pilgrims dying, beggars in horrific condition, the casual cruelty of strangers, the vast indifference of the world. Your family might barely recognize you. Your children might be afraid of this gaunt stranger claiming to be their parent. Your spouse might need time to readjust to your presence. The village would treat you with a mixture of respect and curiosity. You'd completed something remarkable, but you'd also changed in ways that made you slightly foreign, and you had to rebuild your life. If you'd sold your tools or livestock to fund the pilgrimage, you'd need to replace them. If you'd borrowed money, you'd need to repay it with interest. If you'd been gone for a year or more, you'd need to reestablish your place in the community and economy. Some pilgrims couldn't readjust. They'd experienced something so profound and traumatic that normal life felt impossible. A few became permanent pilgrims, traveling from shrine to shrine, unable or unwilling to settle down. Others fell into depression, their pilgrimage having failed to provide the spiritual satisfaction they'd been seeking. So why would anyone voluntarily undergo this nightmare? Faith, primarily. Medieval people genuinely believed that pilgrimage could reduce their time in purgatory, earn them spiritual merit, heal them of illness, or fulfill a sacred vow. The suffering wasn't incidental. It was essential. Every blister, every hungry night, every moment of pain was counted toward your spiritual benefit. There was also social pressure. If you'd made a vow, breaking it was shameful. If your community expected you to go, refusing was difficult. If pilgrimage was prescribed as penance for a serious sin, you didn't really have a choice. And for some, there was an element of adventure. Medieval life was limited and local for most people. You lived in your village, married someone from your village or the next one over, and died in your village. Pilgrimage offered a chance to see the world, meet different people, experience something extraordinary. The suffering was real, but so was the break from ordinary life. But mostly, it was faith. A deep, unshakable belief that this suffering mattered, that God was watching, that the pain had purpose and meaning. Without that faith, pilgrimage was just sadism with extra steps. With it, it was the most important thing you'd ever do. Now let's talk about the people who made this suffering into a career, who turned self-inflicted misery into an art form, who looked at the average pilgrim's experience and thought, I can do worse. We're talking about the saints, those spectacular overachievers of medieval spirituality, who made ordinary pilgrims look like spiritual dilettantes. And among these saints, few embodied the medieval ideal of holy suffering, quite like St. Cuthbert of Lindisfarne. Born sometime around 634 AD in Northumbria, Cuthbert didn't start out trying to be a saint. Nobody does, really. You don't wake up one morning and think, today I'm going to achieve sanctity through extreme discomfort. But Cuthbert, like many medieval saints, had what we might call an origin story. According to legend, he was working as a shepherd, already not a comfortable profession, when he saw a vision of angels carrying the soul of St. Aidan to heaven. This was a formative moment. Not the seeing angels part, which was relatively common in medieval hagiography, but the realization that came with it. If you wanted to get to heaven in style, you needed to suffer spectacularly on earth first. So Cuthbert joined the monastery at Melrose, and this is where his career in competitive suffering really began. Now, monasticism in 7th century Britain wasn't the cozy scriptoriums and illuminated manuscripts affair you might imagine. These were Celtic monasteries, influenced by Irish traditions that viewed physical hardship as a form of prayer. The monks at Melrose didn't just pray and copy manuscripts. They prayed while standing in cold water. They prayed while sleeping on stone floors. They prayed while eating food that would make modern prison cuisine look gourmet. Cuthbert fit right in. Better than fit in, actually. He excelled. He was the star pupil of suffering, the valedictorian of voluntary misery. While other monks would stand in cold water up to their waists during prayer, Cuthbert would go deeper. While others fasted for a day, Cuthbert would fast for a week. He had what medieval people would call devotion, and what modern people might call a concerning relationship with self-care. His reputation grew. People started talking about this monk who took every ascetic practice to its logical and illogical extreme. When he was sent to evangelize in the surrounding countryside, he didn't just preach. He walked everywhere, often barefoot in all weather conditions. He slept outdoors when he could have found shelter. He ate the bare minimum when food was available. It was as if he was conducting an ongoing experiment to determine exactly how much the human body could endure before it simply gave up. And here's the thing about Cuthbert that makes him fascinating. He was successful. Not at killing himself, though he certainly tried, but at inspiring others. People saw this gaunt, weathered monk who clearly hadn't had a comfortable night's sleep in years, and instead of thinking, "That man needs medical intervention," they thought, "That man has a direct line to God." And maybe he did. Cuthbert reportedly performed miracles. He healed the sick, predicted future events, and allegedly had long conversations with angels, though one suspects that prolonged fasting and sleep deprivation might have contributed to the angelic visitations. Eventually, Cuthbert's reputation became so great that they made him Bishop of Lindisfarne, which was one of the most important ecclesiastical positions in Northumbria. You'd think this would mean a nice residence, regular meals, maybe a comfortable bed. You'd be wrong. Cuthbert accepted the position but rejected all its comforts. He continued to live like a hermit, even though he was technically a bishop. He had responsibilities to manage, people to lead, administrative duties to perform, and he did all of this while maintaining a lifestyle that would make a modern minimalist look extravagant. But even being a bishop wasn't ascetic enough for Cuthbert. After a few years, he decided he needed more isolation, more suffering, more direct communion with God through the medium of extreme physical discomfort. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He moved to a tiny island called Innerfarne, which was basically a rock in the North Sea. No shelter, no amenities, just Cuthbert, some seabirds, and the constant howling wind. Innerfarne wasn't a vacation spot. It wasn't even a survival spot. It was a rock where the weather ranged from unpleasant to actively trying to kill you. And Cuthbert chose to live there voluntarily. He built himself a small cell, little more than a stone hut with walls high enough that he could see only the sky, cutting himself off from all visual connection to the mainland. His diet consisted of whatever he could grow in the thin soil, which was almost nothing, and whatever visiting ships might bring him out of pity. He spent his days and nights in prayer, meditation, and what must have been constant, bone-deep cold. The North Sea isn't known for its tropical climate. Even in summer, it's bracing. In winter, it's homicidal. Cuthbert lived there for years, and visitors reported that he seemed genuinely happy, which tells you something about his definition of happiness. Stories about his time on Innerfarne became legendary. One tale describes how he would stand in the sea at night, praying with his arms raised, while waves crashed over him. When he emerged, otters would allegedly come and warm his feet with their bodies. Whether this actually happened or whether Cuthbert was experiencing hypothermia-induced hallucinations is up for debate, but the story reveals what medieval people found inspiring. Not just suffering, but suffering so extreme that even animals took pity on you. Another story describes how Cuthbert once asked some visiting monks not to eat the crop of onions he'd managed to grow, as he needed them for himself. They agreed, but Cuthbert later discovered that ravens had eaten the onions. He prayed, and allegedly, the ravens returned with gifts of lard as compensation. Again, we can question the historical accuracy, but the point is clear. Cuthbert's holiness was so profound that even birds acknowledged their debts to him. But Cuthbert's isolation couldn't last forever. The church needed him. More specifically, the church needed his reputation. A hermit saint living on a rock was inspiring, but a hermit saint who could be trotted out for important ecclesiastical functions was even better. So they convinced him, and it took considerable convincing, to leave Innerfarne and resume his duties as bishop. Cuthbert agreed, reluctantly, and returned to Lindisfarne. But you can't just switch off years of extreme asceticism like flipping a switch. Cuthbert continued to live simply, to eat sparingly, to reject comfort at every opportunity. His fellow bishops must have found him exhausting. Imagine trying to have a church council meeting with someone who refuses to sit down because standing is more spiritually appropriate, and who declines your offer of food because he's in the middle of a fast that's been going on for 3 weeks. Cuthbert's health, unsurprisingly, was terrible. Years of exposure, malnutrition, and sleep deprivation had taken their toll. His body was failing, but his spirit, by all accounts, remained strong. When he realized he was dying, he asked to be taken back to Inner Farn, not to a comfortable monastery with infirmaries and medical care, such as it was in the 7th century, but to his cold, wind-swept rock in the North Sea. He wanted to die as he had lived, in isolation and discomfort, communing with God without the distractions of warmth, food, or human company. And that's exactly what he did. Cuthbert died on Inner Farn in 687 A.D., surrounded by a handful of monks who had made the journey to be with him in his final hours. His last words were reportedly instructions about maintaining monastic discipline and caring for the poor, because even in death, Cuthbert was focused on the serious business of salvation and service. Now, here's where Cuthbert's story gets really interesting, because death wasn't the end. In fact, for medieval saints, death was often just the beginning of their most impressive career phase. The monks of Lindisfarne buried Cuthbert, but they didn't forget him. His reputation for holiness, miracle-working, and spectacular suffering ensured that he remained a figure of veneration. 11 years after his death, they decided to check on his body, expecting to find skeletal remains as was normal. Instead, they found something that absolutely electrified the medieval Christian world. Cuthbert's body was incorrupt. He looked, according to witnesses, as if he'd just fallen asleep. His skin was supple, his joints were flexible, and there was no sign of decay. This was proof positive in the medieval mind that Cuthbert had been a true saint. God doesn't preserve the bodies of ordinary people. Divine preservation meant divine approval. So Cuthbert's body became a relic, and not just any relic, but one of the most important in Britain. His remains were placed in an ornate shrine at Lindisfarne, and pilgrims began arriving in droves. People traveled hundreds of miles to pray at Cuthbert's tomb, seeking miracles, healing, and spiritual merit. The monastery became wealthy from the donations of grateful pilgrims. Cuthbert, who had rejected comfort and wealth his entire life, became the foundation of a medieval religious economy. The irony would have either amused or horrified him, depending on whether death had improved his sense of humor. But Cuthbert's posthumous adventures were far from over. In 793 A.D., Vikings raided Lindisfarne. The raid was brutal, a shock to the Christian world that had considered the monastery inviolable. The monks, faced with repeated Viking attacks over the following decades, realized they needed to move Cuthbert's body to safety. You can't have your most precious relic stolen by pagans. So began one of the strangest journeys in medieval history, the wanderings of St. Cuthbert's corpse. The monks carried Cuthbert's body around northern England for over a century. They moved from place to place, always one step ahead of Vikings, political turmoil, or other threats. They carried him in a wooden coffin, which must have been exhausting. Dead bodies, even incorrupt ones, are heavy. They traveled through Northumbria, stopping at various locations, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, always looking for a permanent, safe home for their saint. Imagine being those monks. You're essentially refugees, fleeing violence and instability, but you're refugees carrying a corpse that you believe is miraculous. You can't abandon him because he's your most valuable possession, both spiritually and economically. But carrying a dead body across medieval England isn't exactly easy, even if the body is supposedly preserved by divine power. Everywhere they went, they established temporary shrines. People would come to see Cuthbert, to pray, to seek healing. The monks supported themselves through these visits, through donations and offerings. Cuthbert, even in death and on the move, was still drawing crowds. Eventually, in 995 A.D., the monks found a permanent home for Cuthbert in Durham. They built a cathedral specifically to house his remains, and Durham became one of the major pilgrimage sites in medieval England. The cathedral was magnificent, built in the Romanesque style that dominated the period, with thick walls, massive pillars, and an atmosphere of imposing sanctity. Cuthbert's shrine was placed in a position of honor behind the high altar, and pilgrims flocked to it. Kings visited. Nobles donated vast sums. Common people scraped together their meager resources to make the journey, hoping that proximity to Cuthbert's holy remains might cure their illnesses, forgive their sins, or simply give them a moment of connection with the divine. The shrine became incredibly wealthy. It was decorated with gold, silver, and precious gems, donated by grateful pilgrims and wealthy patrons. Cuthbert, who had lived in voluntary poverty, was now surrounded by more wealth than most people in medieval England would see in a lifetime. His wooden hermit's cell had been replaced by an architectural marvel. His simple monk's robe was now accompanied by ornate vestments and treasures. But the most remarkable thing was that periodic examinations of his body continued to find it incorrupt. In 1104, when his shrine was being moved within the cathedral, they opened his coffin and found him still perfectly preserved. In 1539, when Henry VIII's commissioners were destroying monasteries and taking their treasures during the Reformation, they came to Durham expecting to expose Cuthbert's incorrupt body as a fraud. They opened his coffin fully expecting to find bones or a wax effigy. Instead, they found a body that still showed minimal decay over 850 years after his death. Even the skeptical Protestant commissioners were impressed, though they still confiscated all the shrine's treasures. Cuthbert was reburied simply, as he probably would have wanted, though his years of ostentatious enshrinement suggest he wasn't getting much say in the matter from beyond the grave. Modern examination of Cuthbert's remains in the 20th century confirmed that his body had indeed been remarkably well preserved, likely due to a combination of factors including the conditions of his burial, the quality of the linen wrappings, and, possibly, the antimicrobial properties of some of the objects buried with him. But in the medieval mind, these naturalistic explanations would have been irrelevant. The preservation of Cuthbert's body was divine, proof of his sanctity, evidence of God's favor. And, in practical terms, whether the preservation was miraculous or natural didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed it was miraculous, and that belief shaped religious practice, economic activity, and cultural identity across northern England for centuries. Cuthbert's cult, and that's the technical term, meaning the organized veneration of a saint, was enormous. He was considered the patron saint of Northumbria. Churches were dedicated to him throughout northern England. His feast day, March the 20th, was a major celebration. Monks and nuns took him as their special protector. Sailors invoked his name during storms, believing he could calm the North Sea that he'd spent so many years standing in while praying. stories of miracles attributed to Cuthbert multiplied over the centuries. He healed the sick, of course. That was standard saint fare. But he also allegedly protected communities from plague, guided lost travelers to safety, appeared in visions to warn of danger, and even influenced the outcomes of battles. When English armies went to war, they sometimes carried relics associated with Cuthbert, believing his spiritual power would aid them. The fact that these armies sometimes lost suggests that Cuthbert's military intervention was less reliable than his medical miracles. But faith isn't deterred by inconvenient evidence. What made Cuthbert particularly resonant in the medieval mind was that his life embodied contradictions that medieval Christianity wrestled with constantly. He was a hermit who became a bishop, combining the contemplative and active lives. He rejected material wealth but became the center of enormous economic activity. He sought isolation but attracted crowds. He embraced suffering but provided comfort to others. These paradoxes made him a perfect medieval saint, someone who represented the tensions within Christian spirituality itself. His life also reinforced the medieval understanding of sanctity as something proven through extremity. You couldn't be a saint by being moderately good. You had to be extraordinarily devoted, willing to suffer in ways that ordinary people wouldn't contemplate. Cuthbert, standing in the North Sea in winter, living on a windswept rock with minimal food, wearing himself down to spiritual essentials, this was inspirational precisely because it was extreme. It set a standard that most people couldn't reach but could admire and, in smaller ways, attempt to emulate. If Cuthbert could stand in freezing water all night, surely you could manage to fast on Fridays. If Cuthbert could sleep on stone, surely you could endure an uncomfortable pilgrimage. The saints weren't meant to be relatable. They were meant to be aspirational, to show what human beings could achieve through faith and determination, even if that achievement looked a lot like self-destruction from a modern psychological perspective. And yet, there's something genuinely compelling about Cuthbert's story, even from our comfortable modern vantage point. He wasn't suffering for show. He wasn't performing piety for an audience. By all accounts, he sought isolation and avoided fame, which kept finding him anyway. He seemed to genuinely believe that physical discomfort brought spiritual clarity, that stripping away material comfort revealed divine truth. Whether he was right is a theological question beyond our scope here, but the sincerity is hard to deny. Cuthbert wasn't a charlatan or a performative ascetic. He was, by medieval standards, and perhaps by any standards, genuinely devoted to his understanding of God, even when that devotion required standing in the North Sea, until otters took pity on him. His influence extended far beyond his lifetime. The community that grew around his cult, the monks of Durham, the bishops who succeeded him, the pilgrims who visited his shrine, shaped the religious and cultural development of northern England. Durham became not just a pilgrimage site, but a center of learning, art, and political power, all because a stubborn monk decided that comfort was overrated and suffering was underrated as a spiritual practice. The Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts from the medieval period, was created in Cuthbert's honor around 715 AD, less than 30 years after his death. The manuscript's artistry, its intricate designs, vibrant colors, and masterful calligraphy, stands in stark contrast to Cuthbert's austere lifestyle. Yet it was inspired by him. The monks who created it spent years on the project, working with the finest materials available, creating a work of stunning beauty to honor a man who had rejected beauty in his own life. Again, the paradox. Cuthbert inspired the creation of art he probably would have considered unnecessary, wealth he definitely would have rejected, and attention he consistently tried to avoid. But that's how sanctity worked in the medieval world. Saints didn't control their own legacies. They lived, they died, and then the church and the people shaped their stories into tools for inspiration, instruction, and, let's be honest, fundraising. Cuthbert's shrine at Durham was immensely profitable. The donations funded the cathedral's construction and maintenance, supported the community of monks, provided charity to the poor, and enriched the bishops who oversaw it all. Was this what Cuthbert wanted? Almost certainly not. But the medieval church operated on the principle that saints, being in heaven and enjoying the beatific vision of God, were probably past caring about earthly economic arrangements. They'd achieved their goal. What happened to their bodies and their reputations afterward was someone else's problem. This brings us to one of the fascinating aspects of medieval pilgrimage and saint veneration, the disconnect between the saint's life and the saint's cult. The person lives one way, often in rejection of materialism and fame. The cult that develops after their death embraces both, using the saint's reputation to generate wealth and prestige. And somehow, this contradiction doesn't bother anyone. The pilgrims don't see the irony. The clergy don't acknowledge it. The system works because everyone involved wants it to work, because it serves both spiritual and practical needs. Pilgrims get spiritual benefits and the hope of miracles. Churches get funding and prestige. The local economy benefits from pilgrim traffic. It's a win-win situation, built on the corpse of someone who wanted none of it. Now, Cuthbert wasn't the only saint whose life was defined by extreme devotion and suffering. Medieval hagiography is full of similar figures. Saint Anthony of the Desert spent decades in isolation in the Egyptian desert, battling what he described as demons, but which modern psychology might recognize as the hallucinations of extreme deprivation. St. Simeon Stylites lived for 37 years on top of a pillar in Syria, never coming down, suffering through heat, cold, and the complete lack of any horizontal surface. St. Christina, the Astonishing, supposedly survived being drowned as a form of torture, then flew up to the rafters of the church during her own funeral mass because she couldn't stand the smell of sinful human flesh, which is quite possibly the most extreme antisocial behavior ever attributed to sanctity. The medieval world produced a spectacular array of saints who specialized in suffering, each finding their own unique way to demonstrate devotion through discomfort. But Cuthbert is particularly interesting because his story is well documented. We have contemporary or near-contemporary accounts of his life. We know about his travels with reasonable certainty. We can trace the development of his cult from its origins to its height, and we can see how one man's personal spiritual practice became a phenomenon that shaped religion, culture, and economics across an entire region for centuries. Think about what Cuthbert's life meant in practical terms for medieval pilgrimage. Here was a saint whose shrine became a major destination. Pilgrims traveling to Durham weren't just seeking generic spiritual benefit. They were connecting with a specific story, a specific person whose life demonstrated what they aspired to, or at least what they believed they should aspire to. When you prayed at Cuthbert's shrine after walking for weeks or months to get there, you were placing your suffering in conversation with his. Your blisters echoed his night in the North Sea. Your hunger reflected his fasting. Your exhaustion paled compared to his years of self-denial. This created a spiritual economy of suffering, where your pain had meaning because it connected you to his story. And Cuthbert's incorrupt body added another layer. Here was physical proof that suffering had value, that denying the flesh could lead to something beyond ordinary death and decay. For medieval people who lived with constant reminders of mortality, disease, violence, short life expectancies, the idea that a body could escape corruption was powerfully appealing. It suggested that the boundary between life and death, between earth and heaven, between temporal and eternal, was more permeable than it seemed. If God preserved Cuthbert's body, maybe God noticed your suffering too. Maybe your struggles had cosmic significance. Maybe enduring hardship wasn't pointless. This is what made saints like Cuthbert so central to medieval spirituality. They weren't just inspiring figures. They were proof of concept. They demonstrated that the religious promises were real, that suffering had purpose, that devotion was rewarded, that heaven was accessible to those who pursued it with sufficient determination and disregard for personal comfort. Of course, we can look at this from a modern perspective and see the psychological and sociological mechanisms at work. Extreme asceticism can produce altered states of consciousness that feel spiritual. Social reinforcement shapes behavior. When people praise your suffering, you're more likely to continue it. Economic incentives drive the promotion of saint cults. Political power is enhanced by controlling access to important relics. All of this is true, but it doesn't fully explain the phenomenon because it doesn't account for the genuine belief, the sincere devotion, the lived experience of people who found meaning in these practices. Medieval people weren't naive. They understood human nature. They knew about fraud and corruption, and yet they embraced saints like Cuthbert, not because they were fooled, but because the stories and the practices met deep spiritual and psychological needs. Human beings seem to have an innate tendency to find meaning in suffering. We tell ourselves that hardship builds character, that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. That pain is just weakness leaving the body. Medieval Christianity gave this tendency a cosmic framework. Suffering wasn't just personally beneficial, it was spiritually efficacious. It earned you merit. It reduced your time in purgatory. It brought you closer to God. And saints like Cuthbert were the extreme examples, the proof that if suffering could be endured, it would be rewarded. This brings us to a broader question about pilgrimage itself. Why did it work? Why did millions of medieval people undertake these grueling journeys, knowing the risks, accepting the suffering, spending money they could barely afford, all to visit shrines of saints they'd never met? Partly, it was about belief in the specific powers of specific saints, but more broadly, it was about the pilgrimage experience itself as a form of spiritual discipline. The suffering wasn't incidental, it was essential. You weren't buying spiritual merit with your money, though money certainly helped. You were earning it with your pain, your endurance, your willingness to put your physical body through hardship for a spiritual goal. This is why pilgrimage routes often deliberately included difficult sections. The Camino de Santiago didn't take the easiest path from France to northwestern Spain. It went over mountains, through valleys, along routes that were challenging even for fit, well-supplied medieval travelers. This wasn't poor planning. It was intentional. The difficulty was part of the point. If pilgrimage were easy, it would be less valuable. The suffering validated the journey, made it meaningful, transformed it from a trip into a spiritual exercise. And saints like Cuthbert embodied this principle at its most extreme. If the journey was supposed to be hard, well, here was a man who made every day of his life a journey of maximum difficulty, who transformed mere existence into an ongoing pilgrimage toward God, who found meaning not in comfort, but in its complete absence. His life was a pilgrimage with no destination except death, and his holiness was proven by how uncomfortable he could make that journey. Now, Cuthbert's story also reveals something about how St. Cults developed. You couldn't just declare yourself a saint. Well, you could, but no one would listen. Sainthood was conferred by popular acclaim, confirmed by miracles, and eventually formalized by church authorities. The process took time and required certain elements. A holy life, often characterized by extreme asceticism or martyrdom, death, miracles attributed to the saint's intercession, a body that showed signs of divine favor such as incorruption, and popular devotion that sustained interest over time. Cuthbert hit all these marks. His life was spectacularly holy. His death was peaceful, but appropriately dramatic, occurring in his chosen place of exile. His body remained incorrupt. Miracles were attributed to him immediately and continued for centuries. And people loved him, flocking to his shrine generation after generation. But not every holy person became a saint. Many lived lives of extreme devotion and died in states of grace but were forgotten, their stories lost to history. The difference often came down to circumstances, dying in the right place, having the right supporters, and being useful to the right institutions. Cuthbert benefited from dying in a major monastery with educated monks who could write his biography and promote his cult. He benefited from the political importance of Northumbria in the 7th and 8th centuries, which gave his story wider circulation. He benefited from his body's preservation, which provided physical proof of his sanctity. And he benefited from the Viking raids, ironically, because his traveling corpse became a unifying symbol for Christian communities under threat, a reminder of their faith and their resilience. All these factors combined to make Cuthbert one of the most important English saints, venerated far beyond the region where he lived and died. His story also illustrates the gendered nature of medieval sanctity. Male saints could achieve holiness through action, Cuthbert as bishop, as missionary, as public figure, or through withdrawal into extreme asceticism. Female saints, with rarer exceptions, had more limited options. They could become martyrs, dying for their faith in dramatic and often gruesome ways. Or they could become enclosed mystics, living in small cells attached to churches, never leaving, experiencing visions and offering spiritual counsel through small windows. The active religious life that Cuthbert pursued, traveling, preaching, administering, was largely closed to women. This doesn't mean female saints were less important or less venerated, but it does mean their paths to sanctity were more constrained. And it meant that the suffering they embraced often took different forms, more focused on bodily mortification and visionary experience than on the outdoor ruggedness that characterized figures like Cuthbert. Medieval people understood this gendered division and accepted it as natural, as part of God's order. Modern people recognize it as a product of patriarchal social structures. Both perspectives have truth. The medieval church was absolutely shaped by gender hierarchies that limited women's opportunities and authority. But within those constraints, female saints found ways to claim spiritual power and influence, sometimes in ways that challenged male authority, even while appearing to submit to it. A female mystic who had visions from God could, at least in theory, claim authority that trumped that of male clergy. a woman who prophesied could speak truth to power. The spiritual realm offered possibilities that the institutional realm denied, and many medieval women used those possibilities strategically. But back to Cuthbert, because his story isn't finished yet. The Reformation brought dramatic changes to how saints were viewed and venerated. Protestant reformers rejected the cult of saints entirely, viewing it as idolatrous and unsupported by Scripture. Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries targeted not just the institutions, but the entire system of pilgrimage and relic veneration that supported them. Cuthbert's shrine at Durham was dismantled. Its treasures were seized. The monks who had tended it for centuries were dispersed. Pilgrimage to Durham was prohibited. And yet Cuthbert endured. His body remained in the cathedral, less ostentatiously than before, but still present. The cathedral itself survived, repurposed for Protestant worship but fundamentally unchanged architecturally, and local devotion to Cuthbert, while no longer official or ecclesiastically sanctioned, continued informally. People still told stories about him. His feast day was still quietly marked. His memory persisted even when his cult was suppressed. This persistence reveals something important about how these religious traditions work. They're not just top-down impositions by church authorities. They're also bottom-up expressions of popular belief and cultural identity. Cuthbert wasn't just a saint. He was part of Northern English identity, a symbol of the region's Christian heritage, a connection to a past that predated the Norman conquest and the centralization of English political and religious authority. You could change the official doctrine, but you couldn't easily erase centuries of cultural memory and attachment. In the modern era, Cuthbert has experienced something of a revival, though nothing like his medieval popularity. Durham Cathedral, now part of the Church of England, acknowledges his historical importance. Scholars study his life and cult as windows into early medieval Christianity. Some Christians, particularly Anglo-Catholics, and those interested in Celtic spirituality, have revived devotion to him as part of a broader interest in pre-Reformation English Christianity. And tourists visit Durham Cathedral partly to see the place where Cuthbert's shrine once stood, attracted by the story of the wandering saint whose body became the foundation of one of England's most impressive medieval buildings. But modern Cuthbert is more historical figure than active spiritual presence for most people. We can appreciate his story without sharing the medieval belief in his miraculous powers. We can admire his devotion without feeling compelled to emulate his asceticism. We can recognize the cultural and economic importance of his cult without accepting its theological premises. This is what happens to saints over time. They become history rather than living spiritual reality, important for what they tell us about the past rather than for what they offer us in the present. Yet, there's something about Cuthbert's story that remains resonant. The idea of radical simplicity, of rejecting material comfort in pursuit of something more meaningful, still appeals to people, even in our hyper-consumptive modern world. The notion that suffering can have purpose, that difficulty can build character or reveal truth, persists even in secular contexts. We may not stand in the North Sea all night praying, but we run marathons, undertake vision quests, travel to remote places seeking meaning. The forms change, but the underlying human tendency to find significance in chosen hardship remains. Cuthbert took this tendency to an extreme, but it's an extreme that reflects something recognizably human. We're not sure what to make of him from our modern perspective. Was he mentally ill, suffering from some form of ascetic anorexia or obsessive-compulsive disorder expressed through religious practices? Or was he genuinely experiencing something spiritual that our secular framework can't adequately describe? The medieval mind would have found these questions baffling. Of course, Cuthbert was holy. The evidence was overwhelming. His life, his miracles, his incorrupt body. What more proof could you need? We're more skeptical, more aware of psychological complexity, more attuned to naturalistic explanations. But we also recognize that reducing Cuthbert entirely to pathology or naturalistic causation misses something important about human experience. People do find meaning in practices that look, from the outside, like self-destruction. Spiritual disciplines do produce altered states and profound experiences. The boundary between psychology and spirituality is blurrier than either strict materialists or fervent believers might prefer to admit. So maybe the best we can do with Cuthbert is to acknowledge him as a complex figure whose life meant something profound to medieval people, and whose story still has the power to provoke thought and admiration, even if we're not ready to follow his example and move to a rock in the North Sea. His endurance, his commitment, his willingness to pursue his understanding of truth regardless of cost. These remain impressive, regardless of our theological positions, and his influence on pilgrimage is undeniable. Durham became a major pilgrimage destination because of him. Thousands of people undertook difficult journeys to visit his shrine. His story inspired other ascetics and hermits. His example shaped how medieval people understood sanctity. In a very real sense, you can't understand medieval English Christianity without understanding Cuthbert. He's not the whole story, but he's a significant chapter, a case study, in how one person's extreme spiritual practice could ripple outward to influence entire societies. The economic impact alone was substantial. Durham became wealthy from pilgrimage traffic. Businesses catered to pilgrims. Jobs were created. Towns along pilgrimage routes benefited from the constant flow of travelers, all because a 7th-century monk couldn't stand comfort and preferred freezing water and isolation to a normal life. This raises an interesting question. Were medieval saints like Cuthbert exploited by the Church? Did institutions cynically manipulate genuine spiritual devotion for economic and political gain? To some extent, yes. The Church absolutely benefited from saint cults and actively promoted them. But it's too simplistic to view this as pure exploitation. The clergy who managed these shrines often genuinely believed in the saints they promoted. The pilgrims who visited were seeking something real and meaningful to them. The economic activity was a side effect, not the primary purpose, though it certainly reinforced the system. It's more accurate to say that saint cults were complex phenomena that served multiple purposes simultaneously: spiritual, social, economic, political, and different participants engaged with them in different ways, all of which could coexist without necessarily contradicting each other. A pilgrim seeking healing could genuinely believe in Cuthbert's miraculous power, while the monk managing the shrine could genuinely believe in the saint's holiness, while also appreciating the donations that supported the monastery. Sincerity and self-interest aren't mutually exclusive. So when we look back at Cuthbert, we're seeing a person, a saint, a symbol, an economic engine, a cultural icon, a historical figure, and a spiritual example, all at once. Medieval people would have emphasized the spiritual aspects. Modern historians emphasize the social and economic contexts. Neither perspective is wrong, but neither is complete alone. Cuthbert contained multitudes, or rather, the meaning of Cuthbert contained multitudes, because ultimately we're not talking about the historical person so much as about how that person's life and death were understood, interpreted, and used by subsequent generations. This is true of all historical figures, especially those who achieve iconic status. They become screens onto which different eras project their own concerns, questions, and values. Medieval people saw in Cuthbert proof of spiritual realities they already believed in. Modern people see in Cuthbert evidence of psychological, social, and economic forces shaping religious expression. Future generations will probably see something else entirely, reading his story through frameworks we haven't imagined yet. And all of these readings tell us as much about the readers as they do about Cuthbert himself. What we can say with confidence is that Cuthbert represents a type of medieval sanctity that modern people find both fascinating and alien. We admire the commitment while questioning the practices. We recognize the sincerity while noting the exploitation. We appreciate the historical importance while being somewhat horrified by the life choices. And that discomfort is valuable because it reminds us that the past truly is a foreign country, that people once understood the world in ways fundamentally different from our own, and that those differences matter for understanding history. We can't really grasp medieval pilgrimage without grasping medieval sanctity, and we can't grasp medieval sanctity without encountering figures like Cuthbert, who embodied it in its most extreme forms. He's our guide to a way of thinking about suffering, endurance, spirituality, and the body that shaped an entire civilization for centuries. Whether we approve of that way of thinking is less important than understanding that it existed, that it was coherent within its own framework, and that millions of people found in it meaning, purpose, and hope. That's the value of studying figures like Cuthbert. Not to emulate them, most of us have no desire to live on rocks in the North Sea, but to understand them, and through them, to understand the medieval world more fully. And with that understanding comes appreciation for both how much we've changed and how much remains constant in human nature. Now, if you were a medieval pilgrim who just visited Cuthbert's shrine at Durham, you might be wondering something practical. Why Durham? Why did Cuthbert's cult succeed here when other saints in other places faded into obscurity? What made a pilgrimage site successful, and what determined which holy places became major destinations, while others remained minor, or disappeared entirely? These questions bring us to the fascinating and sometimes bizarre world of sacred geography, the economy of relics, and the medieval religious marketplace. Because make no mistake, there was a marketplace. Saints competed for pilgrims. Churches competed for donations. And the mechanisms that determined success or failure were a complex mix of genuine spiritual factors, shrewd marketing, political power, geographical convenience, and sheer historical accident. Let's explore how certain places became sacred and others didn't, and what this tells us about medieval religion, economics, and human nature. First, we need to understand that not all holy sites were created equal. Some had obvious advantages. Rome, for instance, had the graves of Saints Peter and Paul, two of the most important figures in Christianity. Jerusalem had the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site where Christ was allegedly crucified and buried. These were Tier 1 pilgrimage destinations, the spiritual equivalents of must-see attractions. If you could afford only one major pilgrimage in your lifetime, these were your top choices. They had scriptural legitimacy, apostolic connections, and centuries of tradition. But most pilgrimage sites weren't so obviously important. They were built around the relics of saints who, while locally significant, didn't have the same universal recognition. Take Canterbury, for example. Yes, Thomas Becket was murdered there, and his death was dramatic and politically significant. But he wasn't an apostle. He wasn't mentioned in Scripture. He was just a bishop who had a very public disagreement with the king and ended up dead on his cathedral floor. And yet, Canterbury became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in England, rivaling even the continental shrines in popularity. How? Several factors made Canterbury successful. First, the dramatic nature of Becket's death. He wasn't just murdered. He was martyred in a cathedral, during evening prayers, by knights who could be linked to the king. The optics were terrible for Henry II and perfect for creating a martyr cult. Second, Becket was quickly canonized just 3 years after his death, which was remarkably fast even by medieval standards. The Pope had political reasons for wanting to make Henry II look bad, and promoting Becket's cult was an excellent way to do that. Third, Canterbury was geographically accessible from London and the continent. Pilgrims could reach it relatively easily compared to more remote shrines. Fourth, and this is crucial, miracles started being reported at Becket's tomb almost immediately. These miracles were carefully documented by the monks of Canterbury, who collected testimonies, verified claims, and publicized the results. They understood that miracles were the currency of successful pilgrimage sites. More miracles meant more pilgrims, meant more donations, meant more wealth and prestige for the monastery. So Canterbury's success was partly genuine spiritual devotion and partly savvy religious marketing. The monks didn't fabricate the miracles, at least not all of them, but they certainly promoted them aggressively. They produced small lead ampullae containing holy water, mixed with what they claimed was Becket's blood, diluted many times over. These ampullae were sold to pilgrims as proof of their journey and as objects with miraculous properties. They were, essentially, medieval merchandise, the T-shirts and refrigerator magnets of their era. And they worked. Pilgrims bought them eagerly, brought them home, displayed them, used them in attempts to cure illnesses or ward off evil. The more ampullae that circulated, the more Canterbury's reputation spread, attracting even more pilgrims in a self-reinforcing cycle of devotion and commerce. This pattern repeated at successful pilgrimage sites across Europe. Santiago de Compostela became important partly because it claimed to have the bones of St. James the Apostle, which was a major draw. But it also benefited from aggressive promotion by Spanish and French religious authorities, who had political and economic incentives to direct pilgrimage traffic through their territories. The Camino de Santiago wasn't just a spiritual path. It was an economic development project, bringing commerce to towns along the route and establishing the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain as important players in European pilgrimage networks. Now, here's where it gets interesting. How did Santiago end up with James's bones in the first place? The story is that James had preached in Spain during his lifetime, which is historically dubious, and that after his martyrdom in Jerusalem, his body was miraculously transported to Spain in a stone boat, which is historically impossible. But medieval people weren't overly concerned with historical plausibility. What mattered was tradition, belief, and the evidence of miracles. In the 9th century, a tomb was discovered in Galicia containing bones that were declared to be James's. How did they know? Divine revelation, supposedly. And once that identification was made and accepted by church authorities, Santiago had a relic of apostolic significance. Pilgrims started coming. Miracles were reported. The site's importance grew. By the 11th century, Santiago was one of the major pilgrimage destinations in Europe, and the economic impact on the region was enormous. Towns along the Camino prospered. Monasteries offered hospitality to pilgrims and received generous donations. Kings and nobles patronized churches along the route. An entire infrastructure developed to support and profit from the steady stream of pilgrims walking across northern Spain. Was James really buried there? Modern archaeological and historical analysis is skeptical. But again, in medieval terms, this question misses the point. The bones were identified as James's by competent authorities. The church was built over them. Miracles occurred there. Therefore, they were James's bones, and Santiago was a legitimate pilgrimage destination. Faith wasn't based on scientific verification. It was based on spiritual truth, miraculous confirmation, and communal belief. And once a site achieved that level of recognition, questioning it became almost impossible. You weren't just questioning the authenticity of specific relics. You were questioning the entire system of pilgrimage, the authority of the church, and the spiritual experiences of thousands of believers. Most people weren't prepared to go that far. So sites like Santiago maintained their status through centuries, regardless of historical accuracy. Now, let's talk about relics more broadly, because the medieval obsession with holy body parts and associated objects was fundamental to pilgrimage culture. Relics were physical connections to sanctity, objects that had been in contact with holy people and therefore retained some of their spiritual power. First-class relics were body parts, bones, teeth, hair, even entire bodies if you were very fortunate. Second-class relics were objects the saint had owned or used, clothing, books, tools. Third-class relics were objects that had touched first-class relics and thereby absorbed some holiness through contact. This hierarchical system meant that even minor relics had value, and that value could be transferred and multiplied through strategic touching. The demand for relics was enormous, far exceeding the supply of legitimate holy objects. This created what we might politely call a robust secondary market and what we might less politely call massive fraud. Fake relics were everywhere. Unscrupulous relic dealers would sell bones of unknown origin, claiming they came from saints. Monasteries sometimes had multiples of the same relic: 4 heads of John the Baptist, 7 arms of St. Andrew, enough pieces of the true cross to build a small forest. Calvin later quipped that if you collected all the supposed fragments of the true cross, you could build a ship. He wasn't entirely wrong. But here's the fascinating part. Even medieval people knew about relic fraud. They weren't naive. They understood that not every bone peddled by a traveling merchant was genuine, and yet the system persisted because it served important functions despite the fraud. Genuine or not, relics were focal points for devotion. They gave people something tangible to connect with, a physical object to pray before, a specific location to visit. The spiritual benefits came from the devotion, the pilgrimage, the act of faith, as much as from the relic itself. So even if you suspected that maybe the fragment of St. Peter's sandal wasn't actually from Peter's sandal, going through the motions of venerating it still had spiritual value. Faith and skepticism coexisted more comfortably in the medieval mind than we might expect. Some relics had better credentials than others. relics with documented histories, verified by multiple sources, housed in important churches, and associated with well-attested miracles were more valuable and attracted more pilgrims. But even dubious relics could serve local needs, providing communities with their own objects of veneration without requiring expensive travel to distant shrines. This brings us to the economic aspect of sacred geography. Pilgrimage was big business, probably one of the medieval economy's most significant industries. A major shrine could make a city wealthy. Think about it. Thousands of pilgrims arriving annually, all needing food, shelter, and supplies. They'd buy provisions, pay for lodging, purchase badges and souvenirs, make donations at the shrine, and pay for prayers or masses. Some would stay for days or weeks, especially if they were seeking healing and waiting to see if their prayers were answered. All this activity generated substantial wealth. Cities with major shrines invested heavily in infrastructure to accommodate pilgrims. They built hospitals, not in the modern sense, but hostelries where pilgrims could stay for free or cheap. They constructed bridges to make access easier. They improved roads, at least the sections leading to their shrine. They regulated merchants to prevent excessive price gouging, because pilgrims who felt cheated might not return or might badmouth the destination to others. A shrine's reputation was crucial, and that reputation encompassed not just the saint's miraculous power, but also the entire pilgrim experience, including how they were treated by the local population. Competition between shrines was real and sometimes fierce. Monasteries would promote their saints aggressively, commissioning biographies that emphasized miracles and holy deeds, sometimes embellishing or inventing details to make their saint more impressive. They'd circulate these hagiographies to spread their saint's reputation. They'd send relics on tour, bringing them to other cities to raise awareness and attract pilgrims back to the home shrine. This practice, called relic translation, was partly devotional and partly marketing. Let people see what your shrine has to offer, get them excited, and they'll plan a pilgrimage. Some shrines engaged in what we might call aggressive acquisition of relics. If your monastery had only minor relics, you might try to acquire more important ones through purchase, gift, or occasionally theft. Yes, relic theft was a real phenomenon, with its own theological justifications. The argument went something like this. If you were able to steal a relic, it was because the saint wanted to be in your possession. Saints controlled their own relics through divine power. Therefore, successful theft was actually a sign of the saint's approval. This logic conveniently ignored the fact that many relic thefts were carefully planned operations involving inside help, bribery, and deception, not divine intervention. But again, faith found ways to explain what it needed to explain. One famous case involved the relics of St. Mark being smuggled out of Alexandria by Venetian merchants in the 9th century. The story goes that they hid the relics under pork in their ship, knowing that Muslim inspectors wouldn't search cargo containing ritually unclean meat. The relics made it to Venice, where they became the foundation of the Basilica di San Marco, one of the most important churches in Venice. The city's prestige was enormously enhanced by possessing the relics of an evangelist. Venice became a major pilgrimage destination and used that status to bolster its political and economic power in the Mediterranean. Was the theft justified? In Venetian eyes, absolutely. They'd rescued Christian relics from Muslim territory and given them a proper home. In modern terms, it was cultural appropriation and theft, but those categories didn't apply in medieval thinking. What mattered was that Venice now had major relics, and that changed the city's spiritual and economic landscape permanently. Not all attempts to create pilgrimage sites succeeded. Many churches had relics, but only some became major destinations. What separated success from failure? Accessibility was crucial. A shrine in a remote location had a natural disadvantage. Pilgrims needed to be able to reach it, ideally along established routes. Shrines near major roads or waterways had significant advantages. Santiago de Compostela was remote, but the Camino provided a clear route, and the journey itself became part of the attraction. Shrines in truly inaccessible locations, however beautiful or historically significant, struggled to attract pilgrims. Miracles were essential. A shrine needed an ongoing record of miraculous interventions to maintain its reputation. This put pressure on the keepers of shrines to document and publicize any possible miracle, leading to generous definitions of what constituted miraculous healing. A pilgrim who arrived with a headache and left without one might be recorded as having experienced a miracle. Someone whose chronic illness improved slightly might be declared healed. Were these exaggerations or frauds? Not necessarily. The medieval understanding of illness was different from ours. They didn't distinguish sharply between psychosomatic and physical ailments. If someone felt better after visiting a shrine, that was healing, regardless of mechanism. And the placebo effect is real. Belief in a treatment's efficacy can produce genuine physiological improvements. So some reported miracles probably were legitimate improvements in symptoms, even if the causes weren't supernatural. Political backing mattered enormously. A shrine, patronized by kings or powerful nobles, had substantial advantages. Royal donations funded elaborate shrines and buildings. Royal pilgrimages brought prestige and encouraged others to visit. Royal protection ensured the shrine's security and supported its economic interests. Conversely, shrines that lost political backing could decline rapidly. If a saint fell out of favor with the powerful, pilgrimage traffic dried up, donations ceased, and the shrine might be neglected or even dismantled. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII demonstrated this dramatically. Shrines that had been flourishing centers of pilgrimage for centuries were destroyed almost overnight once they lost royal protection. The economics of pilgrimage couldn't sustain them without the broader framework of religious support and political legitimacy. Geography created natural pilgrimage networks. Certain routes were more traveled than others due to trade, politics, or other factors. Shrines along these routes benefited from pass-through traffic. A merchant traveling for business might add a pilgrimage detour. A soldier on campaign might visit a shrine along the way. Diplomatic missions might include religious components. The most successful shrines were often those positioned at crossroads, where multiple routes intersected, and where pilgrims heading to different destinations might pass through. Cultural factors also mattered. Some saints had universal appeal, the Virgin Mary, for instance, or the major apostles. Shrines dedicated to them could draw pilgrims from across Christendom. Other saints were more regionally important, appealing primarily to local populations or specific ethnic groups. These shrines could still be very successful within their regions, but didn't achieve the same international reach. Language played a role, too. Pilgrims traveling to regions where they couldn't speak the local language faced additional challenges. Shrines that developed multilingual support systems, monks who could communicate with foreign pilgrims, guidebooks in multiple languages, established communities of pilgrims from different regions, had advantages in attracting, International visitors. The interplay of all these factors created a complex hierarchy of pilgrimage sites. At the top were places like Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela, international destinations that attracted pilgrims from across Europe and beyond. Below them were regionally important shrines like Canterbury, Mont Saint-Michel, or Cologne, which drew substantial pilgrim traffic from specific areas. Further down were locally important shrines that served specific communities or regions. And at the bottom were countless small shrines and churches with minor relics that might attract occasional pilgrims but never achieved widespread recognition. This hierarchy was relatively stable but not completely fixed. New saints could emerge, and if their cults caught on, new pilgrimage sites could rise to prominence. Old shrines could decline if their relics were discredited, if they lost political backing, or if they simply fell out of fashion. Yes, fashion played a role. Pilgrimage trends existed. A newly canonized saint with spectacular miracles could become suddenly popular, drawing pilgrims away from older destinations. A political event, a royal marriage, a military victory might increase interest in shrines associated with particular saints or regions. The medieval world wasn't static, and neither was its pilgrimage geography. Now, let's talk about the practical infrastructure that made pilgrimage possible. Major routes developed networks of monasteries, hospices, and hospitals that provided shelter to pilgrims. These institutions were partially motivated by Christian charity. Caring for travelers was considered a religious duty, and partially by economic self-interest. A hospice might not charge pilgrims, but it would accept donations, and those donations could be substantial. Some hospices were endowed by wealthy patrons who wanted to earn spiritual merit by supporting pilgrims. Others were run by religious orders specialized in hospitality, like the Knights Hospitaller. Still others were operated by municipalities that understood the economic benefits of facilitating pilgrimage traffic. Along major routes, entire industries developed to serve pilgrims. Inns and taverns catered specifically to pilgrim traffic, offering simple accommodations at various price points. Food vendors sold portable provisions suitable for travel. Merchants sold pilgrim equipment, staffs, cloaks, scrips, water flasks. Cobblers specialized in making and repairing the sturdy shoes pilgrims needed. Guides offered to escort pilgrims through dangerous or confusing sections of routes. Money changers helped pilgrims exchange currency as they crossed regional boundaries. And yes, criminals specialized in robbing pilgrims, creating a need for security measures and armed escorts in certain areas. The economic impact rippled outward from major shrines. A successful pilgrimage site could transform entire regions. Towns grew larger and wealthier. Agricultural production increased to feed pilgrims. Crafts and manufacturing developed to produce goods pilgrims needed. Roads improved. Bridges were built. Inns multiplied. The presence of a major shrine was like having a significant industry or resource. It drove regional development and prosperity. This created incentives for communities to acquire or promote saints and relics. If your region lacked a significant shrine, you were missing out on substantial economic activity. So, there was always pressure to discover new saints, verify miracles, authenticate relics, and promote pilgrimage. Church authorities tried to regulate this process, requiring investigation before sanctification, but the bar wasn't particularly high. If enough people believed in a saint and miracles were reported, canonization was likely. The Church couldn't be too skeptical without undermining the entire system of saint veneration. The economics also created tension between spiritual and commercial motives. Clergy managing shrines walked a fine line. They needed to maintain the shrine's sacred character. Too much obvious commercialism would be off-putting. But they also needed revenue to maintain the buildings, support the religious community, fund charitable activities, and yes, enrich the institution. This tension sometimes erupted into scandal. If a shrine was perceived as too greedy, too obviously profit-driven, it could damage the destination's reputation. Pilgrims wanted to believe their devotions were directed toward something holy, not something mercenary. Smart shrine managers understood this and maintained at least a veneer of spiritual purity, even while aggressively pursuing donations. They'd frame requests for money as opportunities for pilgrims to participate in the shrine's holy work, to contribute to the glory of God, to earn additional spiritual merit through generosity. And it worked, because most pilgrims wanted to give. They'd traveled so far, suffered so much, and they wanted their pilgrimage to result in maximum spiritual benefit. If giving a significant donation would increase that benefit, they'd give. This brings us to the theological economics of pilgrimage, the system of spiritual merit, indulgences, and purgatory that made pilgrimage economically rational from a religious perspective. Medieval Catholics believed in purgatory, a state of purification after death, where souls worked off the temporal punishment for forgiven sins before entering heaven. Time in purgatory could be reduced through good works during life, and pilgrimage was considered a particularly meritorious act. The more difficult the pilgrimage, the more suffering involved, the greater the spiritual benefit. Major pilgrimages could reduce your purgatory time significantly. Indulgences formalized this system, offering specific reductions in purgatory time in exchange for specific actions, including making pilgrimages to specific shrines. An indulgence might offer 7 years off purgatory for visiting a particular shrine on a particular saint's feast day. This created an arbitrage opportunity. If you knew you'd accumulated substantial time in purgatory through your sins, investing in a difficult pilgrimage now to reduce that time later made sense. It was spiritual life insurance, paying premiums in suffering to reduce future punishment. The Church promoted this system because it encouraged piety, devotion, and substantial donations. Critics, including later Protestant reformers, saw it as corrupt, a way of commodifying salvation and enriching the Church. Both perspectives contain truth. The system did encourage genuine spiritual devotion and good works. It also enabled exploitation and abuse, with some church officials essentially selling spiritual benefits for cash. But for medieval pilgrims, these criticisms were largely irrelevant. They believed in purgatory. They believed in the spiritual efficacy of pilgrimage. They believed that their suffering had meaning and value in God's economy. So they undertook journeys that, from any purely rational secular perspective, were irrational, expensive, dangerous, uncomfortable, time-consuming. But from within the medieval Christian worldview, these journeys made perfect sense. You were investing in your eternal future, using temporary suffering to avoid much worse suffering later. What could be more rational than that? The sacred geography of medieval Europe was thus a complex overlay of spiritual belief, economic reality, political power, and human psychology. Certain places were sacred because people believed they were sacred, and that belief had real consequences. It directed human movement across the continent. It shaped regional economies. It influenced art, architecture, and literature. It created communities and identities. The pilgrimage routes themselves became sacred, with their own traditions, stories, and significance. The Camino de Santiago wasn't just a path to a shrine. It was a spiritual journey with its own meaning, marked by crosses, chapels, hostels, and landmarks that became part of the pilgrimage experience. What's fascinating is how arbitrary much of this was. Why did James's relics, if they were even really his, end up in Spain rather than somewhere else? Historical accident and medieval politics, why did Canterbury become so important? Because a king's knights murdered a bishop at an opportune moment for cult formation. Why did Durham house Cuthbert? Because monks fleeing Vikings needed somewhere to rest. None of these outcomes were inevitable. Different events could have led to entirely different sacred geographies. And yet once these patterns were established, they became durable, shaping behavior and belief for centuries. This reveals something important about how religious traditions work. They're not purely top-down impositions or purely spontaneous grassroots phenomena. They're complex interactions between authorities and communities, between belief and practice, between stated ideology and lived experience. A shrine succeeded when all these factors aligned, when authorities promoted it, communities embraced it, miracles were reported and believed, economic incentives supported it, and infrastructure made it accessible. Remove any of these elements and the shrine struggled. This also means that the medieval pilgrimage system was more flexible and responsive than we might assume. New shrines could rise, old ones could fall, routes could shift, practices could evolve. The system had structure and stability, but it wasn't rigid. It adapted to changing circumstances, new saints, political shifts, and economic realities. And within this system, individual pilgrims made their own choices based on their own circumstances and motivations. Some chose destinations because of specific needs. Particular saints were believed to specialize in curing specific ailments. Some chose based on accessibility and cost. Some were fulfilling vows made by others. Some were performing court-ordered penance. Some were seeking adventure or escape. The diversity of motivations meant that pilgrimage could accommodate many different kinds of people and purposes, which helped sustain the system's vitality. Now, one more aspect of sacred geography deserves attention: the role of relics in creating sacred spaces. Relics didn't just attract pilgrims. They consecrated the places where they rested. A church with important relics was fundamentally different from one without them. It was holier, more powerful, more spiritually significant. This belief had practical consequences. People wanted to be buried near relics, believing that proximity would benefit them in the afterlife. Churches with important relics could charge premium prices for burial plots. Wealthy people endowed chapels near relics, establishing perpetual prayers for their souls. Monasteries competed to acquire relics partly for prestige and partly for revenue, because relics meant donations meant wealth. This created fascinating dynamics. Some relics were portable and could be moved relatively easily. Others, like entire bodies or large stone tombs, were essentially fixed in place. Portable relics could be strategically deployed, sent on tour, given as diplomatic gifts, used to establish new shrines in promising locations. Fixed relics anchored their sites permanently, creating sacred geography that couldn't easily be changed. When relics were moved, it was a major event requiring theological justification. The translation of relics involved elaborate ceremonies demonstrating that the saint approved the move. How could you tell if the saint approved? Well, if the translation succeeded without disasters, that was taken as approval. If something went wrong, the relics were too heavy to move, someone involved fell ill, the weather turned bad, that might be interpreted as the saint's disapproval. This belief gave communities leverage against authorities who might want to seize or relocate their relics. You couldn't just take someone's saint without risking spiritual consequences. This protected some shrines from predatory relic collection by more powerful churches or nobles. The spatial arrangement of shrines created pilgrimage circuits. Some pilgrims would visit multiple shrines on a single journey, especially if they were located along the same route. This encouraged cooperation between shrines rather than pure competition. If your shrine was on the way to a more important destination, you could benefit from pass-through traffic. Some smaller shrines essentially position themselves as stops on major pilgrimage routes, offering a place to rest and venerate additional saints while en route to the primary destination. Over time, certain combinations of shrines became traditional circuits, with pilgrims expected to visit them all to complete a proper pilgrimage. This created regional pilgrimage identities and networks that shaped travel patterns for centuries. The medieval sacred landscape was thus layered and complex. At its foundation was belief in saints, relics, and miracles. Built on that were economic structures supporting and profiting from pilgrimage. Overlaying those were political considerations as rulers and institutions used pilgrimage for their own purposes. And threading through all of it were individual pilgrims making personal decisions based on faith, need, circumstance, and opportunity. Understanding this complexity helps us see medieval religion not as a monolithic system imposed from above, but as a living, evolving set of practices and beliefs shaped by countless interactions between people, institutions, and ideas. It was messy, sometimes contradictory, occasionally corrupt, often sincere, economically significant, spiritually meaningful, and absolutely central to how medieval people understood their world and their place in it. The sacred geography they created, the shrines, routes, and practices, was one of the medieval period's most distinctive features, influencing everything from architecture to economics to literature. And it all rested on belief. Belief that certain places were holy, that certain objects had power, that suffering had meaning, and that the journey mattered as much as the destination. Now, let's follow the money more directly and talk about the churches themselves, the institutions that managed shrines, promoted saints, facilitated pilgrimage, and profited enormously from the whole system. Because while pilgrims were focused on salvation, churches were juggling spiritual responsibilities with very earthly economic realities. And the most successful pilgrimage churches became wealthy beyond what most medieval institutions could imagine, creating both opportunities and temptations that shaped religious life for centuries. Let's start with the basics. How did pilgrimage churches make money? The most obvious source was donations. Pilgrims who experienced healing, who felt spiritually moved, or who simply wanted to demonstrate their piety, would donate money, goods, or property to the shrine. These donations ranged from a few coins dropped into a collection box to massive endowments from wealthy nobles establishing perpetual prayers. Churches encouraged donations through various means. The shrine itself was designed to inspire awe and generosity. Elaborate decoration, precious materials, dramatic lighting effects. The relic would be displayed in an ornate reliquary, often made of gold and studded with gems, demonstrating the value placed on the saint's remains and implicitly suggesting that pilgrims should contribute at a similar level of generosity. Miracle accounts were carefully maintained and publicized. A book of miracles would be kept near the shrine, documenting healings and interventions. Pilgrims could read these accounts or have them read to them, reinforcing belief in the shrine's power. New miracles were investigated by shrine officials, who would interview witnesses, examine evidence, and document outcomes. This process served multiple purposes. It verified genuine experiences, filtered out obvious frauds that might damage the shrine's credibility, and created official records that could be used in promotion. Successful miracles were celebrated with special masses and sometimes commemorated with artwork or inscriptions. The pilgrim who experienced the miracle might commission a votive offering, an object left at the shrine in gratitude. These offerings ranged from simple candles to elaborate sculptures or paintings. Wealthier pilgrims might endow chapels, fund construction projects, or establish perpetual masses. All of this translated to revenue for the church. Beyond direct donations, churches sold merchandise. Remember those badges we discussed earlier? They were produced in vast quantities and sold at significant markups. The raw materials, lead, pewter, simple designs, were cheap. The perceived value, proof of pilgrimage, spiritual protection, sacred association, was high. The profit margins were extraordinary. Some churches produced hundreds of thousands of badges over centuries, creating steady income streams that supported the entire institutional apparatus around the shrine. Other items sold included candles, which pilgrims would light at the shrine, holy water or oil blessed by contact with relics, small reliquaries containing third-class relics, and various religious objects like rosaries, crosses, or prayer books. All of this constituted a substantial commercial operation that needed managing. Churches also benefited indirectly from pilgrimage through the broader economic activity it generated. Inns, taverns, and shops near major shrines paid rent to the church if they were on church property. Markets held on church grounds generated revenue through vendor fees and taxes. The church might operate its own hostel, inn, or hospital, charging fees or accepting donations from pilgrims who used these facilities. Some churches owned agricultural land, mills, or other productive assets whose value increased due to the presence of pilgrimage traffic. The economic multiplier effect of a major shrine could be enormous, with benefits extending far beyond the immediate donations made at the shrine itself. This wealth had visible effects. Major pilgrimage churches were architectural marvels. Canterbury Cathedral, Durham Cathedral, the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. These weren't modest parish churches. They were massive stone structures with elaborate decoration, soaring vaults, stained glass windows, and artistic programs that took decades or centuries to complete. All of this required enormous funding. Pilgrimage provided it. The more pilgrims came, the more money flowed in, the more ambitious the construction and decoration could be. And improved architecture and decoration attracted more pilgrims, creating a virtuous cycle that could transform a modest church into a magnificent cathedral over generations. The churches that managed major shrines developed sophisticated administrative structures. You needed people to manage the physical shrine, cleaning, maintaining, guarding against theft. You needed clergy to conduct services, hear confessions, and minister to pilgrims. You needed officials to manage finances, record donations, oversee properties, and handle legal matters. You needed craftspeople to produce badges and other merchandise. You needed support staff to maintain buildings and grounds. A major shrine was like a corporation, with dozens or hundreds of employees, complex operations, and substantial revenue. Managing this required skills that weren't primarily spiritual. You needed good administrators, competent accountants, shrewd negotiators, and sometimes ruthless business people, willing to maximize revenue and protect the church's interests. This created tension within religious institutions. On one hand, churches were supposed to be focused on spiritual matters, on serving God and facilitating salvation. On the other hand, they were economic enterprises with payrolls, properties, and responsibilities that required money. The clergy, managing these institutions, had to balance competing imperatives, maintain spiritual legitimacy while maximizing revenue, appear humble while sitting on substantial wealth, preach charity while aggressively pursuing donations. Some churches manage this balance well, using their wealth for broadly beneficial purposes like charity, education, and supporting the arts. Others became nakedly commercial, operating more like businesses than religious institutions. The most successful maintained appearances carefully, ensuring that the commercial aspects were somewhat hidden, or at least presented in spiritual terms. You weren't buying a badge. You were making a donation and receiving a token of appreciation. You weren't paying for access to relics. You were contributing to the shrine's maintenance and receiving the privilege of veneration in return. This framing mattered psychologically and theologically. It allowed the system to function without appearing too transactional. But everyone involved understood the economic realities underneath the spiritual language. The competition between shrines that we discussed earlier had sharp economic edges. When one shrine gained prominence, others might lose pilgrims and revenue. This created incentives for churches to promote their saints aggressively, sometimes by embellishing miracle accounts or competing on price and services. Some shrines offered better accommodations for pilgrims. Others emphasized their superior miracle-working power. Some promoted special indulgences available only at their location. It was religious marketing, complete with competitive strategies and positioning. This competition could get ugly. Churches sometimes accused rivals of housing fake relics or falsifying miracle accounts. These accusations were difficult to prove or disprove, but they could damage reputations and redirect pilgrim traffic. Church authorities occasionally had to intervene in disputes between shrines, arbitrating claims and trying to maintain order in what was essentially a religious marketplace. The most successful shrines developed brand identities, if we can use that modern term. Canterbury meant Becket's martyrdom and the political drama with Henry II. Santiago meant the Apostle James and the long journey across Spain. Rome meant the Apostolic See and the heart of Christendom. Each shrine had its own story, its own unique selling proposition, in modern marketing terms. And these identities were cultivated carefully through art, architecture, literature, and public relations. Pilgrimage guidebooks played a crucial role in shaping shrines' reputations. These medieval travel guides described routes, highlighted attractions, noted good and bad accommodations, and provided information about saints and their miracles. Some were produced by the shrines themselves or by friendly authors who received compensation or support. Others were more independent, offering frank assessments based on travelers' experiences. Either way, guidebooks influenced where pilgrims went and what they expected when they arrived. The wealth generated by major shrines created social tensions. Local populations sometimes resented the church's economic power and tax-exempt status. Merchants complained about church-operated businesses that competed with them while enjoying special privileges. Reformers criticized the commercialization of sacred spaces and the apparent hypocrisy of clergy preaching poverty while living in splendor. These tensions periodically erupted into conflict. Popular movements sometimes targeted wealthy churches, demanding reform or redistribution of resources. Church authorities usually managed to suppress or co-opt these movements, but the underlying grievances persisted. The Sahaiti Protestant Reformation was partly fueled by disgust at the commercial excesses of the pilgrimage system, particularly the sale of indulgences. Martin Luther's criticism of indulgences wasn't just theological. It was aimed at a corrupt system that, in his view, exploited people's spiritual anxieties for financial gain. The pilgrimage church's wealth also made them targets for secular authorities looking for resources. Kings and nobles saw rich churches as potential sources of funding, either through taxation, forced loans, or outright seizure. Churches resisted these demands when they could, claiming ecclesiastical immunity and divine protection. But ultimate political power rested with secular rulers, and when they decided to take church wealth, there wasn't much the churches could do. Henry VIII's dissolution of English monasteries demonstrated this brutally. Wealthy shrines that had operated for centuries were stripped of their assets in months. The relics were discredited or destroyed. The treasures were confiscated. The buildings were repurposed or demolished. The economic blow to regions that had depended on pilgrimage traffic was severe and lasting. But in the medieval period's prime, before the Reformation disrupted everything, the pilgrimage churches operated a remarkably successful system. They provided spiritual services people genuinely wanted and needed. They facilitated experiences that were meaningful and transformative for many pilgrims. They supported charitable work, education, and the arts. And yes, they made money, sometimes enormous amounts, and used that money in ways both admirable and questionable. Understanding this duality, genuine spiritual function coexisting with economic exploitation, is key to grasping medieval religion. It wasn't either-or, it was both and. The same institution could sincerely minister to pilgrims' spiritual needs while calculating profit margins on badge sales. The same clergy could be genuinely devoted to their saint while strategically positioning their shrine in the pilgrimage marketplace. These contradictions are uncomfortable for us because we prefer clear moral categories. But medieval people seemed more comfortable with ambiguity, or at least more practiced at maintaining cognitive dissonance between spiritual ideals and practical realities. The pilgrimage churches also served as centers of cultural production. The wealth flowing through them funded artists, musicians, writers, and craftspeople. Illuminated manuscripts, sculptures, paintings, musical compositions, architectural innovations, all of these were supported by pilgrimage revenue. Some of the medieval period's greatest artistic achievements were created for pilgrimage churches, commissioned by clergy who wanted to glorify God, honor their saints, attract more pilgrims, and demonstrate their own prestige. The motivations were mixed, but the results were often magnificent. So when we think about medieval pilgrimage, we need to see the full system. Pilgrims seeking spiritual benefits, walking for months in difficult conditions, arriving at elaborately decorated shrines managed by churches that were simultaneously religious institutions and economic enterprises, staffed by clergy who were both spiritual ministers and business administrators, all participating in a system that generated enormous wealth while claiming to transcend worldly concerns. It was complex, contradictory, and absolutely fascinating. And it worked for centuries, because it met real needs even while serving institutional interests. People wanted connection to the sacred. They wanted hope for healing. They wanted assurance of salvation. They wanted meaning in their suffering. The pilgrimage system provided all of this at a price. The price was literal: money, time, physical suffering. But for most pilgrims, the price seemed worth paying because the alternative, living without hope of spiritual benefit, without connection to God, without meaning to assign to suffering, seemed worse. The churches understood this and structured their operations accordingly. They weren't purely cynical. Many clergy genuinely believed in the spiritual value of what they offered. But they also weren't purely altruistic. They benefited substantially from the system and worked to perpetuate and expand it. This intersection of faith and commerce, of genuine devotion and economic self-interest, characterized medieval pilgrimage and distinguished it from both purely commercial activity and purely spiritual practice. It was uniquely medieval, a product of a society that hadn't yet developed our modern separation between sacred and secular, between spiritual and economic realms. For medieval people, these realms overlapped naturally. God worked through material objects. Spiritual benefits could be earned through physical actions. Holy people deserved material support. Wealth could be used for sacred purposes. None of this seemed contradictory to them, though it might to us. So when we judge the pilgrimage churches harshly for their commercialism, we're applying modern standards to a medieval phenomenon. Better to try to understand it on its own terms, as a system that combined genuine religious devotion with economic pragmatism, that provided real spiritual services while generating real wealth, that inspired both great art and great avarice, and that shaped European society for centuries in ways both positive and problematic. The pilgrimage churches were products of their time, responding to the needs, beliefs, and economic structures of medieval Christianity. They succeeded spectacularly at what they set out to do: facilitate pilgrimage, promote their saints, provide spiritual services, and, yes, make money. And they failed, at least by their own stated ideals, to avoid the corrupting influences of wealth and power. They were, in short, very human institutions trying to mediate between heaven and earth, between divine and worldly concerns, and achieving mixed results that probably shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with human nature. The legacy of these churches persists. The great cathedrals they built still stand. Tourists and pilgrims still visit, and their saints' stories still inspire or intrigue us. We can visit Durham and see where Cuthbert rested, walk the Camino to Santiago, explore Canterbury Cathedral. The physical infrastructure of medieval pilgrimage largely survives, though the system that created it is long gone. But understanding that system, how it worked, why it worked, what it meant to the people involved, gives us insight into a world that was both alien and recognizable, where faith and money mixed freely, where suffering was currency, and where hope, however commercialized, was always available for those willing to walk far enough to find it. And that brings us to the end of our journey through medieval pilgrimage. We've walked alongside exhausted pilgrims, stood in cold North Sea waters with Cuthbert, mapped sacred geography and economic flows, and followed the money through elaborate church institutions. We've seen how faith and commerce intertwined, how suffering was valued, how saints were made and marketed, and how millions of people undertook journeys that, from our comfortable modern perspective, seem almost incomprehensible. But here's what we should take away from all this. Medieval pilgrimage worked because it addressed fundamental human needs that haven't changed. We still seek meaning. We still want to believe that our suffering has purpose. We still look for connections to something larger than ourselves. We still undertake difficult journeys in hopes of transformation. The forms change. We might run marathons instead of walking to Santiago. We might seek enlightenment through meditation retreats instead of pilgrimages to saints' shrines, but the underlying human drive remains. Medieval people weren't naive or foolish. They were people like us, trying to make sense of life's hardships, looking for hope, seeking community, wanting to believe that their existence mattered. Pilgrimage gave them a framework for all of this, a way to turn suffering into purpose and random hardship into spiritual achievement. It wasn't perfect. It was exploited. It enriched some at the expense of others. But it also sustained faith, created community, inspired art, and gave meaning to countless lives. So as you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, maybe spare a thought for those medieval pilgrims limping down muddy roads, sleeping in flea-infested inns, and hoping desperately that the saint they'd walked 700 miles to see would notice their devotion and grant them grace. They were seeking what we all seek: hope, meaning, connection, and maybe a miracle. They just had to work a lot harder for it than we do, which either makes them admirably devoted or spectacularly masochistic, depending on your perspective. Either way, their stories deserve to be remembered, their suffering acknowledged, and their faith, however mixed with commerce and exploitation, respected for what it meant to them. That's the real pilgrimage. Not just understanding the physical journey, but comprehending the spiritual landscape that made that journey meaningful. And with that understanding, we can appreciate medieval pilgrimage not as something strange and distant, but as a profoundly human response to universal concerns, expressed in forms unique to its time, but rooted in needs we still recognize. Thank you for taking this journey with me. I hope you've learned something, laughed at least a little at the absurdities of medieval life, and gained some appreciation for how different the past really was. If you enjoyed this exploration, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment telling me what other medieval topics you'd like to explore, and hit that like button. And remember, the next time you complain about uncomfortable travel, at least you're not walking to Santiago in shoes made of cowhide while worrying about bandits. Sleep well, and be grateful for antibiotics, weather-resistant clothing, and the general lack of compulsory suffering in modern life. Good night.